As I told you, I'm going to do that again. Good morning, everyone. So I told you today we are recording today's session because there are a few people that absolutely couldn't make it due to their jobs. And I also want to make sure that you can look back at it before your test, which will be posted up later this week for those of you in intro. Those of you in sex, gender, and power, there may be a quiz. We'll see. I'm very pleased to have arranged this for you so you can learn a little bit more about our government and all of that. A few housekeeping rules. I will make sure everyone is on mute unless they're called to ask a question. If you have a question, which most of you sent me your questions ahead of time, good job. Put your question in the chat and you will be, when you get to that portion, you'll be taken in order of your question so that we have a queue and a line. And Will Barrett, who is with the Congressman, he and I will determine if the questions are even answered or if it's something that even is appropriate to be answered in this venue. We also have this morning Dr. Caputo with us, who is going to formally introduce the Congressman. So, Dr. Caputo, feel free to take the stage.
Thank you, Professor Alford. First, let me say welcome, COD students. I hope you're doing well in the virtual environment. I know that this has been a challenging time for you all. I will say, though, that COD has done reasonably well as far as I can see in terms of transitioning to the online environment. The instructions being delivered, people are working from home as best as possible. I know it's a bit stressful, but please hang in there. This will end eventually. We are online for the summer just basically because as you look at the foreseeable future, it doesn't appear that it's quite safe yet to be able to bring large numbers of people together. But eventually this will pass and we'll be back on campus and everything will be back to normal. So hang in there and keep on with your studies. It's a good time to get those things done while you're not able to do the other things that you normally like to do. I'm very pleased to have with us Congressman Sean Casten. Congressman Casten has really dedicated a lot of time to engaging COD. I don't know if I've seen any actually of our elected officials spend so much time on campus and spend so much time at events that are on campus. So he pushes himself to engage in COD life. I've seen him at Frida Kahlo events. I've seen him now he's in classrooms. See him at other events here on campus. It's really we really appreciate having him around. He really understands College of DuPage and appreciates higher education. So without further ado, I know you'd want to hear from Congressman Casten, and thank you for being with us.
Thank you so much, Dr. Caputo. Thank you, Professor Alford, for having me here. I was saying to Will at the start of this that you know, as disruptive as this whole process is for all your lives, this is sort of going to be a generational defining moment, and I can't think of a better lens to think about that through than sociology. There are so many things that we are going to look back 20, 30, 40 years from now, and people are going to say, well, your generation was the generation that went through this. And there's all these little places it shows up that I'm not even sure we know the biggest things that are going to impact us yet. But you know, I was talking to somebody yesterday who's got a high school senior, and he said high school seniors this year have lost memories. They don't have proms, they don't have graduation, like all that stuff that you all had, you know, a year or two ago. They're never going to have that memory. And is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing? It's a thing. It's going to define them. My 4-year-old nephew, when I go to visit him, I can't pick him up and I can't tickle him, and nobody else can either. And how much of like who we are as human beings comes from the fact that, as you know, particularly when we're younger, we need human contact. And you know, and these things that define us in all these peculiar ways. And you know, I would love to see if anybody's ever written one. What was sort of the cultural detritus that washed through from the 1918 pandemic? Because I'm sure there were impacts at the time, and I never learned about it before. Maybe that's because no one wrote the book. Maybe it's just because I wasn't taking the right classes. But it's interesting to think through. Now, how that all relates to what we're doing in Washington is that if we're really honest, we are all in the midst of taking this giant class that's a postdoc level class, and none of us have done the reading. And the reason we haven't done the reading is because nobody wrote the book. We've injected almost $3 trillion into the U.S. economy in the last 45 days. There has never been that scale of investment in the economy. We've been doing this, trying to get the money to where it needs, but at the same time trying to get out quickly. And there's a tension between that we're all well aware of. And when you see the stories in the newspapers about why did this person get money and this person didn't, that's that tension between how you get it out quickly and how you get it to where it needs to go. And we're all working through that in real time. But along with that, there are all these questions that we have to think through about and not just money, but from a policy perspective, what does the world look like and what is the world going to become as we go forward? Because that, to the extent there's a gap between what we need and what we have, that at the end of the day is sort of the role of government. And we're having this very real-time conversation about what's the role of government, what's the role of the private sector, what are the limitations on that? There's this whole conversation about the Defense Production Act. Should the president use his power to mandate that companies will make personal protective equipment, test kits, mobilize them quicker? Well, if the president does that, he can force companies to work at margins well below their typical profit margin. If he doesn't do that, and you're the CEO of one of those companies, what does your board expect you to do? Should you make trade-offs for the good of society or your obligations to shareholders? Those are tricky questions. And if you think there's a black and white clear moral answer, you're being a little bit simplistic on it. But we are having this conversation in real time around what should government do in moments like this and what should the private sector do. Think about the conversation about who are essential workers. If you would have asked society a year ago who are the most important people in society, I'm going to guess that the answers to most of those questions would not have included garbage men, postal workers, grocery store workers, and yet all those are the people working in meat packing plants. And yet those are all the people that as a society, we've decided whatever else, you all have to work. You all have to go through, and you have to be exposed to certain risks. And if you look at the people who can afford to telework, and we say, yeah, it's not really critical that you come to the office today, you can work from home. Those tend to be the jobs that make a lot more money. Well, there's an interesting conversation to have about that. There are, Professor Alfred, I'm sure you have more thoughtful thoughts on this than I do, but I was talking to teachers recently who said that this is fundamentally changing how they teach, because this is more like at the high school, elementary school level. They said that in 3 months ago they taught to the test. Today they're teaching for wisdom, and that's a different teaching style. How much of that survives after this? I don't know. When we get through this, do businesses accelerate the trend towards automation, which is a function of how nervous are people about going back and working side by side with people? And what does that mean? As this crisis has highly exaggerated existing inequities in our society, people who don't have health insurance are in a much worse way than people who do. The mortality of COVID is vastly higher in lower income minority communities than in wealthy white communities. Should we be focused on addressing those fundamental inequities first, or should we be focused on COVID first? We've got to make decisions there. There's then a whole series of ethical questions that are really tricky to think through, and man, these get to the heart of sociology. Who should get tested first? There's no easy answer. And there is no consistent set of rules. Each state is a little bit different. Each hospital is a little different. In general, we're testing people who are symptomatic, but symptomatic is defined in different ways. How high a fever do you have to get a test? Do we have enough extra tests to test the frontline healthcare workers? Or do they only get tested if they become symptomatic, in which case they would become vectors of disease? Well, that sort of depends on how many spare tests you have. If you are a famous celebrity person and you have access to lots of people and knowledge, should you get tested? Is that reasonable? What if you do? Should you disclose that you get tested? Now, then you get a second question, because you're probably thinking about that in the context of the U.S. This is a global pandemic, and in general, as poor as the United States has done on testing, and when I say poor, on a per capita basis, Iceland has tested 10 times as many people as we have. Estonia has tested, Bahrain has tested 5 times as many, more as we have. We're really behind the ball in testing, but we are doing a vastly better job in the developing world. And that means that while we have, whether by design, whether by intent, doesn't really matter. For all practical purposes, we have prioritized testing rich people on a global basis. Well, now think about what that means as we start to develop vaccines. Who should get vaccines first? And you can frame that as a moral question, and maybe you come to one set of conclusions. But now suppose you're a vaccine developer and you've got a really promising vaccine in development. Where's the best place for you to test the efficacy of that vaccine? Well, it's probably way better off in the developing world because you have a much higher proportion of people who are at risk of infection because of the quality of public health. So if our goal is to get vaccines to the rich world quicker, you're better off first developing it in a place where there's a lot of poor people, because you're just going to have better statistics and a more target-rich environment to find out whether the vaccine works. These are really thorny ethical questions. Should we do challenge trials? Challenge trials are this idea there's some notorious examples from our history, but essentially, should you intentionally infect people with the disease in order to test the efficacy of a cure? Now, normally you would never do that morally. Think of the Tuskegee syphilis experiments. We look back on that and say that was a shameful moment in our history. But on the other hand, if you're sitting there and saying, I'm going to take a population of 100 people, I'm going to infect all of them with this disease, I'm going to try to treat them. Worst case scenario, 100 people die. Best case scenario, I develop a drug that saves 100,000 people. Would you take that risk? This is the trolley problem, across our whole population. And frankly, a lot of you guys are, I don't know, Professor Alford, if you've taught them about the trolley problem, I always like this. It's this fun little sociology experiment, which actually ended up being a whole theme of an episode of The Good Place, if you want. But it's this experiment where they asked people, you're standing by a train track, the track diverges as you go down the road, and you're standing there and you've got the switch. And if you don't throw the switch, the trolley's going to run over a baby. Would you throw the switch and make it change the tracks? And everybody generally says, yeah, I'd do that. And so then the follow-up experiment is same trolley, same track, same switch. If you don't throw the switch, the trolley's going to run over 2 babies. If you throw the switch, it's going to run over 1 baby. Would you throw the switch? Morally, it's the same question. Your actions save a life of a stranger. But now you're deciding who lives and who gets to die, and that's a much trickier problem. Well, that sort of theoretical academic trolley problem is all around vaccine development and how we think through it. And then just the last thing, to think about legislatively before opening up to your questions is what are the constraints on the freedoms that we have asserted are self-evident? The basic freedoms of our Constitution. Do they stand close scrutiny in this moment? And again, these are hard questions. If you think that our Constitution is inviolable, was handed down on stone tablets, and you can never adjust it, okay, that's a vantage point. Tell me what you think about freedom of assembly. When people crowding together in a single space makes them vectors of disease and potentially gets you and your loved ones sick because they become vectors. Do we need to think about what freedom of assembly gets in this moment? What do you think about freedom of speech if someone can go on television and encourage people to use a cure that actually doesn't cure or dangerous, like saying you should inject disinfectant, let's say? We've already decided in the Supreme Court that you can't yell fire in a crowded theater. How is that different? And again, there are no easy answers to these questions. But as I said at the start, you all are living in a giant experiment in the moment that will define your generation. I have the I don't know if it's a luxury, the opportunity. It is the experience of trying to figure out within Congress, what should we do legislatively to get through this public crisis as quick as we can, to get through this economic crisis as quick as we can, to do it in a way that is as responsible as possible and leads to the the greatest good for the greatest number of people. And it is intellectually fascinating, but it's hard. And that's what we're spending a lot of our time doing at this moment. And hopefully I've provoked something to think about for you guys, and we will open up the chat.
Yes, please. You guys had such great questions. Ask. Well, can you talk about the U.S. Postal Service while we're waiting for a student to ask questions? And remember, you guys get credit for the questions that you post here. It's not just willy-nilliness.
Yeah, so the U.S. Postal Service it's exactly that question about essential workers. As we have gotten to a point where things that we used to do in person, we now have to get through mail. We are depending more and more on the Postal Service. And that means both, things that we order and get delivered to our homes. It will in all likelihood mean how we vote in November. And the Postal Service as an institution, which by the way, Benjamin Franklin created our Postal Service. Postal Service is, I think, older than the country, or darn close to it. Mm-hmm. The Postal Service, by its mission, has to deliver mail to every U.S. address. It's very cost effective to deliver to a whole apartment building in downtown Chicago. It's really cost ineffective to deliver to a rural address where the houses are 5 miles apart. But it's the same price stamp on all of them. And so the Postal Service has by its structure, and because we've said that everybody should have equal access to the Postal Service and to mail, by its structure, the post office has some significant internal subsidies. They make money on urban deliveries, they lose money on rural deliveries, and it bounces out. And as the needs of the Postal Service change, and in particular as some of the Amazon deliveries and UPS have been essentially picking off some of the urban deliveries that are the high margin deliveries, the Postal Service has become a little bit squeezed in its business model. And unfortunately, that has become a partisan fight, which it shouldn't be. But for us to continue to make sure that every American has equal access to the mail, we need to make sure that we have a long-term viable model for how to get that done. And frankly, my own view is that as we look towards the next election, we cannot do what they did in Wisconsin, where we essentially said to voters, you have to decide between your health and your vote. In Illinois, we've got a pretty robust early vote. You can vote by mail and participate that way. Not all states do that. In the CARES Act, which was the big $2.2 trillion bill that we passed, the House version, we included $2 billion to give every American a vote by mail ballot with a postage paid return address envelope. The Senate didn't like that, and so ultimately that didn't survive. But I think ultimately, before we get to November, we're going to have to put something like that in, because otherwise we're asking people to choose between their democracy and their health. And I think that's a completely unfair thing to ask the American citizens.
Thank you. So we have several questions now popping up. So Jamie, why don't you come on and ask your question? There you go. You unmuted. Perfect.
Good morning, Congressman Sean Casten. Since you are part of the Climate Crisis Committee and having a pandemic going on, what is your thought on the environmental change with the coronavirus?
So the environment is improving because of coronavirus, but for all the wrong reasons that are not sustainable. And so, I think we can, I've always described climate change as sort of like we're in the wrong lane on the highway and there's a truck coming, and occasionally we slow down. And when you slow down, that's the opportunity to change lanes. It's not the opportunity to say, whew, looks like that truck isn't coming on as fast. Maybe it's not going to come anymore. And essentially what's happened with there's this famous equation. I think Bill Gates gets credit for it, but it was around long before he started popularizing it. It says for any pollutant in our air and our water, so just think about it for CO2 for the moment. The emissions we release are the population of the world, multiplied by the energy use per capita, multiplied by the greenhouse gas intensity per unit energy. And policies that focus on reducing the greenhouse gas intensity per unit energy, shifting from a gasoline-powered car to an electric vehicle, shifting from coal to solar, deliver the same standard of living for all people with less greenhouse gas impact. Population policies that reduce the energy use per capita are, some of those are positive. So for example, if you insulate your home, if you turn off the light when you leave the room, you still have just as good a quality of life. You're just conserving and finding ways to have the quality of life you want with less total energy. Some of those are economically destructive. Like, for example, we could all go back to churning our own butter. That would reduce our energy use per capita, but would be fairly disruptive to our lifestyles. So that one's tricky. The first bucket is you can also reduce population. That one's very morally problematic, to put it mildly. Essentially, what's happening with COVID is that we are seeing primarily a massive reduction in people's quality of life. We're traveling less, we're flying less, businesses are shutting down. And the result is that we're seeing a big reduction in CO2 emissions, but not in a sustainable way, and certainly not in the way that I think is going to give us the kind of lifestyle that we have become accustomed to and a cleaner economy. The good news is there's other ways to do that. The other thing, though, that I think is worth noting about this is that global CO2 emissions are down about 5% from COVID. The goals of the Paris Climate Accord, which every single scientist will agree are actually not sufficient to get us to where we need to be, would require CO2 to fall this year by 7%. So it's giving us some taste of what we have to do, but I think a lot of the policies that we're trying to get done in the Climate Committee are to get them done more in that third bucket of reducing the CO2 intensity per unit energy than the more disruptive ones. But it does give some sense of the scale of what we have to do if we're going to hand off a sustainable planet to our kids.
Thank you, Congressman. Next up, we have Lily's question. So go ahead, Lily.
Good morning, Congressman. I was just wondering if there were any strategies to dealing with this virus that you're seeing done in other places in terms of testing, in terms of, I would like to know specifically contact tracing that you would like to see implemented here in Illinois.
So it's a great question, and I had the benefit of a nice long conversation with Dr. Jim Kim, the former head of the World Bank, and former president of my alma mater back in New Hampshire as well. His observation was that what we should be doing is, number one, a massive increase in testing. We're getting better, but we still need probably 2 to 3 times as many tests per day as we're doing right now to make sure that we are testing a statistical sample of the population and not just limiting to people who are symptomatic. So that's number one that we need. Number two that we need is a huge and very robust program of contact tracing. We're generally doing a pretty good job of contact tracing people who get positive tests, but it's going to get harder as tests become more local. If you have to go to the hospital to get a test, the hospital's got all sorts of protocols to track what you're doing. If you can do at-home testing, if you can take a swab and send it in the mail, you're now in a position where we need some rules around, if you get a positive test, if you get a negative test, how do we get those statistics into the system so that we can build out the network and knowing how the contact tracing works. I was on a call with Bill and Melinda Gates yesterday, and they were outlining that really the right way to do that some countries have started to do. They said Germany has done this really well, is essentially set up a government-run website where anybody who wants a test has to first enter their data in the website, and then your test result gets loaded in the same website. And if you get a positive result, you basically have to go through and say, okay, who have you been in contact with over the last period? And then they get alerted. The Gates said that that New York State has done a pretty good job of that. Germany has done a national job of that, but we have not done a national initiative on that. And you really can't do this at a state level because the virus doesn't know where state borders are. And there certainly is no reason why someone in New York State didn't come into contact with someone from Pennsylvania, during the period they were infected. So we need a more organized national program on that. The third thing that Dr. Kim recommended, which really nobody is doing yet, is significant. Well, with one exception, is we need to have isolation. And what he observed was that in China, where they did a pretty good job early on of testing and contact tracing, they locked down people by family. So maybe you couldn't leave your apartment building for a week until you were clear. But he said that what happened was that the virus went from spreading from family to spreading within families. And as China has now tried to reopen their economy, this is what he's saying in the data. It's hard to get data from China, but I trust that he's got access to data. He said they're saying they reopen a section and then there's a surge of new cases because you had the virus sort of clustering around in certain homes. And so what he has been recommending, and I guess he's got Massachusetts now doing a test program for this, is if people test positive, you need to get them isolated, not just from other families, but from their own family as well, which means getting them into a location where they've got housing, where they've got food, where they've got communication needs. And that's expensive. And it also, it can be pretty disruptive, but it's a heck of a lot less disruptive than tens of thousands of people dying. And so he said, basically, if we want to have a program where we are confident that we have extinguished the virus before we have a vaccine available, which is 12 to 18 months away, you really need to invest in that isolation strategy as well. And again, other than a test program in Massachusetts, I'm not aware that anybody's doing that yet.
I'm isolating. I haven't left my apartment in 6 weeks. It's very sad. Anyway, our next two questions. Well, technically I left twice, but next two questions are actually ironically the same. The one sent it to me privately and the other sent it to me for everybody. So Derek and Hamid, you both get credit for asking the question, but I'm going to have Hamid, if you'll unmute and ask your question.
Yeah, okay, so good morning, Congressman. I was wondering how necessary you would say community development and education is for society as a whole.
I don't know how you get by without it. I mean, I think the Enlightenment was a good thing, right? I think in general we do an extremely good job in the United States at providing resources for community development and education. In general, we do not do a very good job of doing so equitably across all the country. And there's a guy who I'd highly recommend, Raj Chetty, who's done this fascinating research around income and wealth mobility. How likely are you to have a high income, to have a lot of wealth relative to your parents? And when he goes through his data, there are all the racial inequities you would expect to find in that data, which are sad and depressing. But what really pops as you go through is that the single best predictor that you are going to be in the top quartile of wealth is not your race, it's your zip code. And he's gone through to look and say that even within one community, so if you just look just within Glen Ellen, you can drive around and I'll bet you anything that you can identify some lower income places in Glen Ellen where the outcomes are vastly different than the higher outcome areas in Glen Ellen. And it's really a compelling case that since we've done a good job of providing these resources, but a poor job of making them equitable, it really reframes how you think about, where should we build public housing? Because if we build public housing in the part of town where you get to go to the good school, we will change the entire trajectory of a life. If we build public housing in the part of town where rich people are satisfied that they don't have to see you or deal with you, we will also change the entire trajectory of a life. Those things have big impacts. And so we need to do it, but we need to think about the equities a little bit more. Not like, yes, we should do it for moral reasons, but we should also do it because, talent is pretty evenly distributed around society. Opportunity isn't. And to the extent that we can make sure that everybody with talent has equal access to opportunity, we're all better off. You never know where the next Elon Musk is going to come from.
So, Derek, if you can go ahead and ask the second part of your question, since it took it into a different place.
I mean, basically, my question is, will you still do your job if you weren't getting paid a lot?
Sorry, would I still do my job, or would people still do their job?
Would you still do it?
If I wasn't getting what?
Pay a lot.
Bailout?
Paid a lot.
Oh, so here's the thing, and this is going to sound sort of crass. I made a lot more money in my last job. If you really want to make money in this life, there's a lot better there's better things to do than going in to be a member of Congress. And that can sound very crass because, you know, the salary you get as a member of Congress is higher than the average salary. But I will tell you that the overwhelming majority of my colleagues are in it because they're public servants. If your goal is to make money, if your goal is to have, you know, be home and be with your family every night, if your goal is to have the protections of a certain amount of anonymity and not have people say mean things about you on television, this ain't the best job, because you can get all those in other places. If on the other hand, you have things that you really want to accomplish, that you think are important, that make our society better, it's a pretty terrific job, and that's the reason I do it. It's I didn't take it for the pay cut.
Yeah. Congressman, for the record, since it is public record, would you mind sharing for everyone what a congressman does typically make?
Yeah, so a member of the House of Representatives who is not in leadership makes $176,000 a year. If you are, I think the speaker, who is the top of the pay scale for in the House, makes, I think it's like $211,000 a year. Senators make a bit more. And again, these are big numbers. Like I don't mean to make light of that. It's well above the median income. But it's not what you'd make in a lot of other careers that are less public.
Thank you. Next up, Alyssa, you have a question.
Hi, Congressman. My question was just if this virus, this like whole situation is the only thing you guys are like talking about right now, or are you guys still like discussing like the prior topics that you guys had before, like this whole thing?
So it's not the only thing we're discussing legislatively until we get back to regular order in Washington. It's the majority of what we're legislating on, and that's really tricky. I mean, we will have to go through and do the appropriations process, and so appropriations is going on. We of course still have all the things we do on a non-legislative basis in terms of, you know, working with the communities, reaching out to find out where there are needs, educating the public on what's going on, basically being public figures. All that doesn't change with this. But the structure of Congress, you know, at the risk of being a little bit Schoolhouse Rocky, you know, a bill becomes a law because somebody has an idea. They put a bill in the hopper. It's then referred to the relevant committee. The leadership of the committee reviews and decides to put it on the calendar for markup. You then meet with the committee. You work through. People offer amendments. People then vote for the amendments or against the amendments. Then they vote for the bill or against the bill. If the bill passes out of committee, it's then referred to the floor. You have debate on the floor and it goes forward. Well, almost every step I just talked about requires us to be in physical proximity of each other. It's difficult to do a committee meeting by Zoom call. It's especially difficult if what we're working on involves classified information, because these platforms we're on right now are not totally secure. Some things that are not classified from a national security perspective, they're still for political reasons. You may want to hammer out some details before you open it up because maybe there's Maybe you've got something that you know is going to be net positive for society, but there's going to be some groups in society who are net worse off for this and some that are better. And you kind of want to work through that stuff privately and sort out those equities before you go public with it. Those things are just hard to do in remote working. And we are trying to figure out how to do that. The rules committee is in sort of continuous negotiations between the Republicans and the Democrats about trying to come up with some package that everybody's comfortable with, and is also keenly aware that if we were, for better or for worse, we are bound by our existing rules. And our existing rules say things like, you know, in order to have a vote, you have to have a quorum, and a quorum is defined by the number of people present in the room. If we were to pass legislation that violated our rules, anybody who didn't like that legislation could go to the court and say this rule isn't valid because it wasn't done according to the rules of the United States Congress, and that would be they'd win that case. So we're working through a lot of those issues in real time, and until we get that all sorted out or get comfortable being back in Washington in some more consistent fashion, which is going to start next week, but exactly what consistent fashion means is hard to say. It is necessarily slowing some of those other things down a bit, which is frustrating, but it's hard to see a way through that in the immediate term.
Travis, you're up next.
Morning, Congressman. I was wondering what your initial thoughts on COVID-19 when you found out about it, and were you skeptical at first, and were you expecting us to be in quarantine to stay in plus longer?
Look, I don't think anybody predicted how this was going to play out. My initial thoughts, and maybe this is just because I'm in engineering by training, is that geometric rates of progression always scare me. Our brains are not wired to think through them very well. I still do when I talk about climate change to people. I do a little exercise, and I can't do this because you're all on mute. But if I say A, B, next thing in your head is probably C. If I say 2, 4, next thing in your head is probably 6. Nobody thinks 2, 4, 8, 16, right? And what was so pernicious about the sort of the early data that we were seeing on COVID was that you had this sort of, recall in those early days, even though they were low numbers, you were seeing a doubling of the rate of infection every 2 to 3 days. And if you double every 2 to 3 days, you get the entire world infected, in a matter of months. And the conversation, recall that political conversation at the time, was people saying, well, it's only 15 infections, it's not big numbers, it's only 300 infections, it's not big numbers. And it was that exact 2, 4, is it 6 or is it 8 kind of problem that you could see that we were going to underestimate because we weren't thinking it was this kind of curve, we were thinking it was this kind of curve. And I think we predictably under-responded initially, and we're paying the price now for coming in late. Now, having said all that, when I say we, I basically mean every country in the world except for those countries that really got hit by SARS, because the countries that in recent memory dealt with SARS tended to be the ones that clamped down much quicker. I was meeting with the Japanese embassy in Washington really early on. This was back in, I want to say, early February, and they told me that they had locked down Japanese schools for a month at that point already. And there'd been a very small number of cases, and I said, like, that seems like an overreaction, and oh, by the way, your economy isn't growing that fast, that's really going to be a death knell. And he looked at me and he said, what other choice did we have? And so those points where even in my own head I wasn't quite thinking through the logic, but those countries that had been exposed to SARS and had seen how that geometric doubling works moved very proactively early on. Hope that answers.
Thank you, Congressman. A similarly related question, I'm going to jump ahead to Emilio. So if Emilio, you could ask your question, since it's taking that question to another level.
Okay. So my question is pretty much, where do you see American society in a year regarding social interaction and public gatherings? And do you think there will be any future like regulations in regards to this topic?
I think ultimately that's a sociology question. The no, and I mean that seriously. I mean, I've if if the president, the governor, your senators, your members of Congress were all to say to you, everything's good, go back to normal, but you didn't individually feel safe, it's going to be your decision of whether to go to a Cubs game, right? It's going to be your decision of whether to go to Lollapalooza, and the question is going to be at what point do us as individuals get comfortable with going back to normal, or do we have a new definition of normal? And I don't know what the answer to that is. Because that's sort of a not just a mind reading question. That's being able to read the minds of 6 billion people. I think things will change. How they change, hard to say. But that's why I was saying at the start, like some of the equities to be thought through is if there continues to be a reluctance to gather in large public places, that probably means that employers are going to be accelerating the push towards automation. Well, what does that mean for employment going forward, right? And not just in the, you may think of automation in terms of factories, or going to Panera and doing rapid checkout. If you ever go to a big Wall Street bank where there's all these really highly paid traders sitting around in these big pits with all these computer screens around them, most of those people could be replaced by an algorithm, and the banks know it, and they've been sort of slowly introducing algorithmic trading to try to ease that transition. Well, if all of a sudden, a bunch of New York City investment bankers don't want to go and sit at a computer screen right next to somebody else, does JP Morgan say, all right, fine, we're just bringing out the algorithms quicker? What does that do for employment levels? What does that mean for, if we're still generating the same amount of wealth as a society, but we're generating it with a higher proportion of robots to individual workers? What's the appropriate ways to distribute that wealth? These are thorny questions. And I think we're going to figure out in real time how that plays out. I smell a sociology research paper here for Professor Alford to assign as soon as this is over.
Actually, you mentioned that my class over the summer that I'm teaching, the final exam is for us to write a group paper on this whole Merlot. So it's already been in the works. I just need to have at least 6 students in my class.
You're welcome.
Cassie, your question has already been asked sort of, but it has been answered in the answer for a previous question. So I just wanted to acknowledge that I saw it. And Rita, we're going to come back to your question. There's questions that dig deeper into what we've been talking about right now. So I want to jump ahead. So hopefully we have time to come back to you, Rita. Don't feel slighted though. Let's see, I want to jump on to Iceline. Can you go ahead and ask your question, Iceline? Where you dig a little deeper and then you take it a little bit different direction.
Hello, Congressman. My question is, what are your thoughts on states opening up early? Do you think it's going to increase the COVID-19 cases? And also, I read where animals have been getting tested, and I was wondering, where do these tests where do they go to get their animals tested? Do veterinarians have these test kits too, or? Yeah, that's my question.
So I don't know the answer to how animals are getting tested. In general, the tests are all being processed at a fairly finite number of places. It's just a matter of who sticks a swab in a nostril or wherever else the virus is, and then it's just a matter of taking that sample and getting it to a PCR machine. So how that's being done, I don't know. I don't think that's being very widely done right now. The first part of your question on states opening up, it's a bit of a dice roll, and And again, if you look at those countries that have started to go up, this goes back to what Jim Kim was saying. If you don't really have the virus locked down and quarantined out of the system, then we're going to see races fall. We open up, and then you see a spike, and then they fall, and they open up, and a spike. And if you look at the case history in Singapore, that's essentially what's happened. And that's a really tricky trade-off, right? Because even if you're looking at this solely from a public health perspective and leave the economic impacts aside, people who stay home, don't work, can't make money, means they can't go to the dentist, they can't get their teeth cleaned, they can't get a checkup. You've got mental health issues. There's a whole lot of public health issues that come from people being home. So there are trade-offs that are there. But to really responsibly open up, and again, I say this as much as a legislator, as a citizen who's going to make decisions about whether to go out once it is opened up, you really want more data. You want to know that that we have tested not just the symptomatic people, but the asymptomatic people, to get some sense of who is out there who's still transmitting this virus. There was a really interesting research paper out of Manhattan that, because they had such a high rate of symptomatic cases in Manhattan, they started testing every woman who was coming in to give birth in the hospitals in Manhattan. And so it was actually one of the few places where we had data where we were testing the entire population, not just the symptomatic population. And the data that they collected there suggested that the infection rate may be as much as 50 times higher than what we're seeing in the test data. Well, if that's true, that fundamentally changes what the responsible decision is on opening up. Because if the number of symptomatic cases is falling because we've done a good job of looking out for people who are immunocompromised, but there's still a lot of young, healthy people who are not symptomatic but are carrying the virus and can transmit it to other people, that's going to affect whether we spike back up after we open. The second piece that we really, not only do we not have the test, we don't even know the answer, is, do people have antibodies to SARS in their systems? It's what's called serological testing. And if you do have antibodies, does that actually protect you? We're developing serologic tests. There are places that have done this. Is very inconclusive as to, if you get exposed to this virus and you have antibodies, are you protected? If you've become symptomatic and you've recovered, can you get it again? We don't really know that yet. And the labs are working furiously on it, and there's a global effort to answer those questions. But we don't know, and so that starts to also raise questions of what's the responsible way to open up. So what I think is going to happen, and I'm not saying this because this is ideal, I'm just saying this is what I think is going to happen, is you're going to see some states with a higher risk tolerance than others, and we are going to do a massive experiment in real time to answer your question, and then we're going to find out whether that was a good idea.
Thank you, Congressman. Mac, I want to acknowledge I see your question as well, but I want to stay sort of on this line, and we'll come back to it if there's time. I hope there's time, because I really like your question. So next up, I want to have Danielle take us to the economy.
Hi. So my question was, kind of, what do you think is going to be the long-term effect on small businesses as well as larger companies because of COVID, and then just the economy in general?
This Ben Bernanke told us a month ago, and has proven right, that this will be the deepest downturn in the U.S. economy since we've begun collecting records, and that's true. We are going to see, I think, every part of the economy is going to be spending down all of the cash reserves that it has. Individuals, with money in their bank account are, if they're, with unemployment now at, I think, 14% and still rising, folks are going to be spending down their individual cash reserves. Businesses that have cash, that have lines of credit, as their sales fall, are going to be consuming those cash reserves. State governments that have an obligation to run balanced budgets, don't have additional borrowing capacity, are going to spend down their cash reserves. This is all happening. And the federal government that has the ability to borrow, the ability to print money, is going to run huge deficits. And all of those things are happening, and they are going to continue to happen. And there are going to be an awful lot of people who really don't get through. What happens next? I can hazard a prediction, but this is an educated guess. It's not a wild ass guess, but it's an educated guess. What we're seeing right now is that, if all I told you was that everybody's out of cash and the United States is running massive deficits, that if that's all you know, then you'd say, and as I see the question just came up, inflation should be going through the roof and our borrowing costs should be going up. But what's happened is that that's happening across the globe. This pandemic knows no boundaries. It's in darn near every country. I think realistically, it is in every country. Not every country has testing capacity, but every country is seeing a shutdown in their economy, and everybody's borrowing is going up. And what's happening is that the people who lend money, and those are still out there, right? There are still pension funds that are trying to earn returns. There are still, insurance companies that have to park money somewhere so that they can pay dividends. There are still, pockets of cash that are looking for a place to sit right now. There's really a flight to quality. And so in the private debt markets, if you are a risky company that has a hard time accessing debt markets in the best of times, struggles and bad times, you basically can't get credit anymore, or your credit is really, really expensive. But if you're at the better end, if you're General Electric, if you're IBM, the people are looking for a place to park money. And so those companies are actually getting money really, really cheap right now. And the same thing is happening at the sovereign debt level. So we're seeing in the developing world, borrowing costs are going through the roof. And in places like the US and Germany, people are actually paying us to take their money. You've got negative interest rates, especially after inflation. And I think that's going to sustain for a fairly long period of time. So we're going to have within the US, because we are, as challenged as our economy is, we are still relatively the strongest economy in the world. The Chinese economy is strong, but the Chinese economy is way over indebted relative to us. They have a lot of private debt that you don't see, but there's a lot of debt there. And so we are going to have within the US, access to very cheap money for a long time. And I think the question will become, what do we do with that access? Do we borrow to invest? Do we borrow to take care of some of the inequities? Or do we decide that other sovereign countries and individuals who are sort of strangling under the more expensive debt because they couldn't afford it should be allowed to suffocate, to push the metaphor. I hope we do the right thing there, but I think that's going to be, my guess is that is going to be the bulk of the political, sort of fiscal and political conversation over the next few years.
Continuing down that road, I wanted to acknowledge that, Megan, you have a question, and there's a sub part that we haven't gotten to, but I would like to come back to that. I want to stay on this line of questioning. So I want to, where did it go? Kylie, if you would like to ask your question now, if you would unmute and do that.
Yeah, hi. So obviously all the businesses are closed, and like stores and big shops and everything are closed. How long do you think it's going to be until the economy goes back to normal again?
I think it's going to come back to what I said before. Is the answer is how long before people are comfortable going back out. The sooner, basically, once we solve the public health crisis, I think the economy will come back to normal. The question is, how much damage did we do during that period? And because if you're the local bookshop in Downers Grove, Um, to the extent that, let's say we open up, let's say we got the whole public health crisis behind us tomorrow. That bookshop would probably open up again. People would be happy to go back down there. There may be a little bit of lag in getting new deliveries, but everything is, that bookshop recovers. Let's say in the alternative, people really can't go to that bookshop for another 12 months. Truth is somewhere between those two extremes. In that outside scenario, they probably stopped paying rent. They got foreclosed on. The book stopped coming through. They had to lay off their staff. Some of the staff they laid off went on to find other employment. Some of them didn't. Some of them, maybe become homeless or have health issues that come from all that stuff. That becomes much harder to restart. And I think between those extremes, and this is where I was saying at the start of, we're having this real-time experiment of what is the real role of government and what is the real role of the private sector. At the good end of that extreme, we can essentially count on entrepreneurial activity in the private sector to bring us back. At the back end of that extreme, we're looking at something like the New Deal after the Great Depression, where the only entity that actually has the cash to put people back to work is the federal government. And it would be, I think, the morally right thing at that outer extreme for the federal government to do what we did during the Great Depression, where we built massive infrastructure projects like the Hoover Dam, sent people out. I tell people all the time, my two favorite things from the Works Project Administration, FDR's program, one was all these big infrastructure projects. The other was Muddy Waters, who was hands down the coolest guy to ever live in Illinois' 6th district, lived in Westmont for a long time. But Roosevelt put a bunch of people to work by saying, go around, to take pictures, collect cultural icons. And this guy, Alan Lomax, went around traveling around the rural South, collecting music samples and, essentially popularized people who we now think of as these great blues artists who, have a lasting footprint on American culture. We'll see where that goes, but ultimately the answer to your question depends on how quickly we get the public health crisis behind us.
Dr. Caputo had to step out to go to another meeting, but he did post a question, so I'm going to read it. He said, there's no question that money needs to be injected into the economy to get us through the pandemic. However, what do you see as the financial impacts that we will face in the future because of the assistance packages? Including, feel free to talk about the new assistance package that was just passed last Thursday.
So I think it sort of comes down to what I was saying before, that because I think every economist is assuming that interest rates are going to stay very low, possibly negative for a long time, we have fewer ill consequences of increased federal spending than we did before. I think the challenge is making sure that money gets to where it needs to get to. What we've tried to do in the assistance packages are basically two things. The first is to try to put money in people's pockets that was taken away because of the downturn. So we've given money to businesses, provided they use that money to continue to make payroll for people who they don't really need in the office right now, but we want to keep them employed so that cash still gets into their pocket. We've provided unemployment insurance so that people who have lost their job have extra coverage. We've provided reimbursement for people who need to take more sick leave than they otherwise would have, but their employer doesn't have the resources to do that. So we've provided funding to do that. All of those things have the effect of putting money into people's pockets that used to come from other sources and now it isn't there. The other thing that has been what we've done is to try to reduce the number of expenses coming out of people's pockets. So allowing you to defer student loan payments for 6 months, allowing you to defer your rent or mortgage interest for 6 months without fear of being foreclosed on. And we could go on down that list. All of those things are necessary. Are they sufficient? And how long it lasts? Are they perfect? Absolutely not. As I said at the start, there's a tension between getting the money out quickly and getting it to exactly where it needs to go. And so there is going to be some economic pain that even if everything we did is sufficient, there's economic pain because some of the people who need resources didn't get it. For example, we've provided now over $600 billion to small businesses to keep their folks employed. We have provided no real equivalent level of funding to states and municipalities to keep their people employed, which means that teachers, firefighters, policemen, all these people who are also employed, who also have been salaried, they haven't had the tools other people have. And that's an inefficiency of what we've done, even though we've gotten a lot of money into the economy. And I think dealing with some of the consequences of that are going to be both the economic and health consequences, and other equities are going to take a while to sort through.
Cam, if you'll ask your question. Where's Cam?
Right.
Good.
As ahead with the U.S. handing out money through unemployment checks and stimulus checks, is this the start of another depression?
We're doing our best to avoid a depression, but I don't think the handing out of the stimulus checks is the cause. It's trying to stop it from happening. I mean, a depression at the end of the day is a downturn in the economy. I think we're seeing GDP is, what are they saying? GDP could fall by as much as 10%. I think my guess is that the economic indicators that say you're in a recession or depression are probably already here. Unemployment is likely to be 20% before this is done. I think that's a depression. The handing out of the unemployment, the expansion of unemployment insurance, the stimulus checks, is to try to mitigate the effects of that. But my guess is that when we're all done, we will conclude that economically this classified as a depression. And that's consistent with Ben Bernanke telling us that this will be a deeper downturn than we've ever seen since we've begun recording data. That means it's deeper than the Great Recession, and that's deeper than a recession is a depression, right?
I want to be cognizant of time, so we might only have time for a few more questions. I want to shift gears, and Aaron, you and Eileen ask very similar questions. So since Eileen has had a chance to ask a question, I'm going to go with Aaron to ask your question, but I want to make sure that you incorporate universal health care into your question, Aaron. So if you can slightly adjust it, that's Aaron Murray. So since we have two Aarons on at the moment. I can't. Did she already? Oh, she's there. Go ahead.
Hi. So, looking into the future with universal healthcare, education, and the economy, how do you think this will affect future generations, and like what they can learn from this?
So I think everything that you just mentioned, Aaron, is consistent with what I said at the start, that this crisis is putting existing inequities into stark relief. If we had universal healthcare before this moment, a lot fewer people would have died. And A, because they would have gotten to their doctor quicker, but B, because the people who are most at risk of dying from COVID are the people who had other comorbidities, people with hypertension, people with heart disease, people whose immune system is otherwise compromised. And all those things tend to be concentrated among populations that are poorer, that don't have access to health insurance. I hope when we are done with this that we have developed an appreciation that avoiding something like this in the future requires addressing some of those inequities that we certainly knew about them before. I mean, there's been plenty of public debate about them, but they've not only been brought into high relief by this, but I hope that we've recognized that we're all kind of connected, right? If you go down to Chicago and walk down the street and somebody coughs on you and you get sick, it doesn't matter whether that person had health insurance, whether they were rich, they were poor, the virus doesn't give a damn. The virus truly does not discriminate. And so had we provided those sort of broader social safety nets before, this wouldn't have been nearly as bad, even for rich people who got plenty. And I hope when we get through this, we see that as a more universal truth and not just as a partisan talking point.
And Grace, I want to acknowledge that you also had a question on that topic, and I hope that it was answered. I want to go back to Mac's question. So Mac, if you would ask your question, and we'll take it a little.
I said, how much would you say how much of an impact would you say the pandemic has had on the presidential election, and how do you think it would be handled differently if the election wasn't around the corner?
I'm not sure it would be handled any differently, but I think there's a big difference between the White House and the legislative response. We have done the first bill that we've done now 4 COVID bills. The first bill, the White House said, let's take the money out of the existing Ebola fund, top that up a little bit and spend $2.5 billion to prevent this from happening. $2.5 billion with a B. We've now spent almost $3 trillion. That gives some sense of how the White House was thinking about this versus how Congress was thinking about this, because all the legislation we've done since has been through Congress. That first bill that the White House did, we reframed, made it $8.3 billion, kept the Ebola fund robust, redirected most of the money to vaccine development and treatment. We then passed a bill to expand Medicaid reimbursement to the states, provide unemployment insurance, reimburse employers for paid sick leave. We then passed the third bill to get money to every individual in the country, the Paycheck Protection Program. All that came out of Congress. None of that has anything to do with presidential politics, because nobody in Congress is running for president. It just has to do with dealing with the public health crisis and dealing with the sort of the reality of what the science is telling us that we have to do. What has been, I don't want to be unduly political, but what has been, I think, unusual in this moment is that if you look at leaders around the world, virtually every one of them, with the exception of our president, has seen a significant bump in their popularity as a result of the crisis. Because, and this happened after 9/11, it happens after most crises. When you have a crisis that affects all Americans without and doesn't discriminate, it's an opportunity for the leader of that country to rise above partisan politics and not discriminate and say, we're all in this together, we got to work through to get this together. A, it's the right thing to do. B, it's really politically smart. There will be books written about why our president chose not to make this a non-discriminatory, non-partisan effort, and instead sort of double down on his base. Maybe he's got a political logic, I don't know. But I think that without question, that decision on his part was, I think from a public health perspective, telling people to drink disinfectant, telling people this will go away like a miracle was not wise. But from a political perspective was also not wise, because you can always rally around the flag in moments like this. I will forever be baffled why he chose not to.
So we need to be cognizant of the congressman's time. So Rita, I apologize, we're not going to get to your question. And Jean Paul, I have asked if the congressman can answer your question later. I don't think it's as relevant to the conversation because I'm not even familiar with what that act is. I want to jump to a question that Alexis sent me privately that I think would be a great one to come close to ending. Well, actually, it would be a great ending question, but I have a question to ask before we end that. I wanted to ask the congressman how you are doing. One of the students posed that question in the preliminary questions, and I thought it was an important thing. We should have probably started with it. But how are you doing just in general, not with your job, not with all of that?
Well, it's very kind of you to ask. I'd consider myself extremely fortunate. My family is healthy. We have all been, shut in together for a month and a half now, and we all still like each other. and I don't mean that just like purely pejoratively. Like there are horrible stories that we're hearing right now about families that had some tension before, and we're probably seeing increases in domestic violence and mental health issues. I feel fortunate not to deal with that. And I've gotten to, it's, I wish that we were spending more time in Washington. On the other hand, you take your blessings where you find them, and getting to spend more time with my wife and my daughters has been a blessing. I think the challenge that I'm facing, which is the challenge that we're all facing, is that we all, to varying degrees, have more responsibility than power right now, and that's a struggle, right? Whether we're looking out for family members who we can't go visit anymore, or you're a member of Congress with an obligation to look out for the interests of the 750,000 people I have the privilege to represent, and don't know whether we really have all the tools or the consistency across all branches of government to do it. That's pretty humbling, and it can be pretty stressful, but it's somewhat reassuring to know that we're at least all bearing this burden together.
And Alexis, I'm sorry to say, I think that the way the Congressman just ended that question, I think I'm going to include your question in a follow-up him later. And I want to thank you very much, Congressman, for speaking to my students. I think they got a lot out of it. And do you guys agree that this was a great thing? I see heads shaking. And I know you have, I'm sure, a busy day. So thank you very much for attending. And to anybody, please don't feel slighted that your questions did not get answered directly. Most of them, with the exception of two, were answered in some way in the other questions. So thank you very much, Congressman.
Thank you, Professor Alford. Thank you all for doing this, and everybody stay safe, stay healthy, and just keep in mind that we are all in this together. As I've been telling everybody, if you need a shoulder to lean on, find one, and if you don't need one, lend a shoulder to someone else, because everybody needs one right now.
Thank you. On that note, those of you in my later classes, see you this afternoon, and I see thank yous coming into you. And those in this morning class is officially dismissed. So we'll, two questions. Oh, he's sorry. There's two questions then.